Good day and welcome to today's Conservation Reserve Program Outcomes webinar for December 2022. My name is Jennifer Perez and I'm a National Outreach Specialist with USDA Farm Service Agency. We work with USDA's Farm Production and Conservation Business Center. Okay, sorry about that, folks. If you could please just put your phone on mute and we'll continue the program. So Farm Service Agency works with USDA's Farm Production and Conservation Business Center and our partners to host a series of webinars to address important questions about CRP and to share the results of this research with the public. This webinar is being recorded and will be publicly available on the FSA Economic and Policy Analysis website, which I will add in the chat. Please keep your audio muted during the presentation and feel free to post questions and or feedback in the chat, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. We're extremely excited to learn and share with you today. My colleague Rich Iavana will introduce our featured presenter. Rich is a senior agricultural economist with the Economic and Policy Analysis Division with USDA, and Rich will be co-facilitating today's webinar. Rich?
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Lisa Schulte-Moore is a professor in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management and co-director of the Bioeconomy Institute at ISU, Iowa State. Her research focuses on the integration of perennial cover into the Corn Belt cropland matrix and its impact on a host of ecosystem services. Dr. Schulte-Moore is also co-founder of the science-based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips project, otherwise known as STRIPS. Her and her project team's work on the value of and best practices for prairie strips in collaboration with FSA over the past decade was instrumental in the realization of CRP's newest practice, and that of course would be prairie strips CP 43. She's joined for this presentation. Well, this presentation is on but a fraction of the project's findings, and she's joined for it, I believe, by her former student and in fact newly minted PhD, Matt Stevenson. Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Jennifer. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. As Rich acknowledged, I work in very large teams to be able to do my work, and the work that I'm going to focus on today has co-authors of Jordan Gies, another PhD student in my lab, and then Bob Claver, who's worked very closely with Matt Stevenson and Jordan and I on this work. Some of what we'll be sharing today also features some of the work of other STRIPS investigators, as I've reflected here on this title page. So what are we doing with prairie strips? Well, of course, you know, the main focus of agriculture is to produce crops for society. And, you know, that's what corn and soybeans here in the Midwest is what pays the bills for farmers here. However, it's not just crops that society is demanding from our agricultural landscapes, and that's where Conservation Reserve Program and other conservation programs are really important in being able to keep farms profitable in terms of that crop production, but also address some of the other concerns, such as how do we conserve our soils in our agricultural landscapes? You know, how do we also have clean water? And what about habitat for wildlife? Well, it was those things, those four things coming together, trying to keep our farm landscapes productive for farmers, as well as addressing the concerns of soil loss and degradation, addressing water quality and wildlife habitat is why the FSA, USDA FSA established the Prairie Strips Conservation Reserve Practice, as Rich noted, CP 43. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with prairie strips, here is the basic guidance that FSA has in terms of establishing prairie strips on farm fields. colleague of ours on the strips project kind of developed this infographic to show it in a aesthetic way. But the basic idea of prairie strips is using the Midwest native vegetation, so diverse perennial tall grass prairie species, integrating in that vegetation within the row crop fields, as you can see here in the middle of this photograph, and designing it so that it's intercepting the flow of water and allowing that water to infiltrate, slowing it down as it's moving across the field, and with configuration that hopefully allows those farm fields to be still, operable by farmers, and flexible in terms of their placement to address multiple conservation goals. So as Rich noted, the design of the prairie strips conservation practice was based on some of the work that my team here at Iowa State has and beyond has done over time. We call it the Strips Project, Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. And the initial research was conducted at a National Wildlife Refuge, Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, just outside of Des Moines, Iowa, because they had the land available for us to conduct the experiment and saw the vision of integrating in the tall grass prairie with our dominant agro ecosystems of corn and soybeans. That work that we've done at Neil Smith National Wildlife, you can see in the dark color in the background of this photo is soybeans, and the lighter color is that reconstructed native prairie vegetation. And in our initial experiment, you can see we have multiple strips arrayed across agricultural catchment, with some on the contour in the upper portion of the catchment and some at that base of that catchment, designed to allow water to flow through before it would exit that agricultural field. Research done by my colleague Matt Helmers looked at water quality. You can see some of our instrumentation there in the lower right hand portion of this figure. A key point I want to make with this initial research that we did with prairie strips is that it was done on a catchment scale. And these catchments were fairly small in size, between 1 and 9 acres in size. And the prairie strips that you see here are between about 20 and 30 feet wide on the upslope and up to 100 feet wide in that lower slope position. We started this research starting in 2007. And we found some pretty dramatic impacts in terms of what a 10% integration of prairie strips could do on a row crop agricultural field that was farmed according to no-till soil management techniques. What we found over time is by adding 10% prairie strips to that field, we would see improvements according to multiple environmental parameters. So a 95% reduction in the amount of sediment that's being lost from that agricultural field, 37% reduction in the amount of runoff leaving that field, 77% reduction in phosphorus in the runoff, and 70% reduction in the nitrate moving with water runoff, 70% reduction in the nitrate concentrations in tile water in the groundwater. We also saw beneficial impacts in terms of reducing nitrous oxide emissions, 75% reduction at that foot slope position, that lower portion of the catchment, as well as an increase of about 0.7 tons per acre per year in soil organic carbon over time. We saw increases in pollinator abundance, triple pollinator abundance, as well as doubling of the bird abundance. We saw no additional increases in weeds in the crop fields of the areas that we were looking at. And we saw the impact on crop field just proportionate to the land being taken out of production. So for example, being put in a conservation program. And we found that prairie strips were cheaper and more flexible than terraces and comparable to cover crops in terms of cost. So these findings is what really led to USDA being interested in prairie strips as a potential conservation practice. starting in 2015, the question then was, okay, so we saw these impacts in this catchment scale experiment. Do we see these same level of benefits when we're looking at actual commercial farm fields? So FSA funded this evaluation starting in 2015. And the reason we were able to start doing the evaluation at this time at commercial farm fields is because based on that initial research, farmers started coming forward, farmland owners started coming forward and saying, I think I want prairie strips on my land because it helps me meet my goals for my farms. And the strips team, working in concert with a variety of organizations, by about 2015, we were working with 60 different farmers across Iowa, helping them put prairie strips on their field and then doing some evaluation in terms of what the environmental outcomes were from those prairie strips. So big shout out to our farmland collaborators, farmer collaborators. This work would not be possible without them as well, them allowing us access to their land to do this evaluation. I just want to point out that the initial evaluation that we did, the Strips 1 experiment, is located at that red star here, kind of in the middle of Iowa. Whereas the results of the research that we're going to share with you today is based on the black stars that you see here. So across a much wider variety of sites and distributed across more of Iowa. And also I want to help you understand the difference in scale of the research that we had conducted at the Strips 1 site versus what we're looking at today. This is evaluation done over a much larger scale. So here's an example of one of our research sites where we have a paired comparison, a control field of 49 acres in size that does not have prairie strips but has grass waterways. And then adjacent treatment field that has prairie strips, 32 acres in size, including 2.5 acres of prairie strips. So you can see that looking at the impacts at a much broader scale, and now this Strips 2 experiment. And like with Strips 1, we're trying to look at what are the impacts across multiple metrics. And while today, the focus is going to be on vertebrate wildlife, especially grassland birds, know that we're also, again, looking at multiple different ways that prairie strips might affect the agricultural environment and what else is out there. In terms of our grassland bird objectives, we had 4 key objectives we were looking at. First, we were looking at comparing the density of grassland birds in field with prairie strips to other grassy features that are commonly found on farms. And especially we were looking at brome filter strips and buffer strips, because those are sort of the status quo, what is more commonly done in terms of conservation practices in this area. So we wanted to evaluate whether prairie strips were providing more conservation outcomes than sort of is the typical conservation practices. We looked at comparing the density of bird nests in prairie strips, again, comparison to these other commonly found grassy features on row crop farms. We're looking at comparing nest survival across these features, and we had the goal of trying to inform conservation planning. So with that first objective, the methods that we used was to estimate bird density using the agricultural landscape. And the method is a bird point counts using distance estimation. As I mentioned, a PhD student in my lab, Jordan Gies, who's pictured here, is working on this evaluation. We have 6 years of data that we're looking at that the evaluation was conducted during the breeding season for birds, so May to July from the year 2015 to 2020. And we looked at bird density on 12 different commercial farms, looking at cropland with prairie strips, cropland with grass strips, and then also fields that did not have grassy features as a sort of control. We randomly located the initial point on the land within the crop field, and then other locations for the bird points counts were allocated after that initial random point was selected. And so you can see sort of the grid array of sampling that we used in that lower left-hand photograph. In terms of the amount of data we have data on over 16,000 detections of birds using our field sites. And we found 81 different bird species using the agricultural landscapes across these 6 years. Of these birds, 17 are considered grassland birds, with the most commonly occurring birds being red-winged blackbirds, dickcissels, which are a species of greatest conservation need in the state of Iowa, and common yellowthroat. In terms of the grassland bird density, you can see our results here with clear differences between farm fields. Again, these are corn and soy bean fields that have prairie strips versus farm fields that do not. They either have a conventional, corn or soybean crop, or corn and soybean crops with the grass strip, which is typically comprised of the cool season grass, smooth brome. So statistically different and more grassland birds being found on farms that have the prairie strips. In terms of those 3 species that are most commonly found on farms, we again see higher densities of red-winged blackbirds, higher densities of dickcissels, and higher densities of common yellowthroats, again on the fields that have the prairie strips. We also found a clear trend across time associated with the establishment of prairie strips. This result mimics what we also found in the Strips 1 experiment, where even in that initial year of establishment, we're seeing more birds using the farm fields with prairie strips. So finding habitat in that short stubble associated with the installation of a prairie strip. We oftentimes think of prairie strips as taking 3 years to establish. So you can see, we see a step up in year 2 and 3 of establishment. And one of the reasons it's lower in those years is because of the established management that occurs, oftentimes mowing. But by years 4 through 7, we're seeing very consistent and more stable levels of densities of birds, with 4 to 5 times higher levels of grassland bird densities than what is found on cropland without prairie strips. The one thing I will say, though, while we are seeing grassland birds using these areas, it's not area sensitive birds such as bobolinks or Henslow sparrows. It's the more common grassland bird species such as the red-winged blackbird, the dickcissel, and common yellowthroat that are not as area sensitive. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Matt Stevenson, who just defended his dissertation a month ago, to talk about his results on the nest density and survival.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm going to share results of my dissertation research, which was focused on nest density and survival. This is conducted at about the same time as Jordan's research. Our active season was May through July, 2015 through 2019. We used 11 commercial farms throughout Iowa. And for our nest density estimates, these are derived from double observer plot searches in different kinds of on-farm conservation practices. And our nest survival data is derived from locating and monitoring nests through time until they either succeed or fail. For our nest density results, we searched 530 plot years. Plots were searched every week for a total of 9 to 12 times per season. And we found 322 nests in formal plot searches. 9 of those, 9 species of grassland nesting birds, and about half of them were red-winged blackbirds, and most of the rest were dickcissel. And then a handful of 7 other species were found in our search plots. Those denoted with an asterisk are considered species of greatest conservation need by the Iowa DNR. So we're gonna go through the most important variables in our modeling of what descriptors of the landscape and the vegetation are good predictors of nest density and then survival. So starting out with nest density, a habitat configuration variable, patch count, was a good descriptor of nest density. So in a landscape that contains about 45% grass within either 150 or 200 meters of the search plot, having more patches near the search plot resulted in higher nest densities for red-winged blackbirds and for those 9 species of grassland nesting birds analyzed as a group, but it did not have a statistically significant effect for dickcissels. Edge density was also a good predictor of nest density. So edge density is anywhere where a grassland land cover comes together with a different kind of land cover, primarily row crop, but also could be other things like developed land cover or woodland patches or whatever. So edge density didn't have a statistically significant effect in landscapes that didn't have a lot of grass in them. So in the 21% grass landscape, you can see those relationships are mostly flat, but the effect of edge density increased when there was more grassland habitat nearby, with higher nest densities predicted for red-winged blackbirds and grassland nesting passerines as a group, but not for dickcissels. And then a couple of vegetation variables were also important descriptors of nest density. So visual obstruction here is a correlate, a stand-in for vegetation density, how tall and how dense the vegetation grows. And this was a good predictor of nest density for red-winged blackbirds and grassland nesting passerines as a group, where the more dense vegetation in the search plot, the more nests we found. But wasn't a good descriptor for dickcissels. And similarly for vegetation richness, this is a way to measure vegetation diversity. It's simply the count of vegetation species we found within the search plot. This was a good predictor for dickcissel nest density and grassland nesting birds as a group, but not for red-winged blackbirds. Because of the way we did our vegetation surveys, we got some bonus science out of this. We're able to look at the vegetation community right where the birds chose to build their nests compared to the vegetation community within 5 meters of the nest. And we could see which plant species birds associated their nests with more often than you would expect given the plant species occurrence on the landscape. On the top of the list here in red are plant species that birds tended to avoid relative to their occurrence on the landscape. And heading that list is smooth brome grass. I think probably what's going on here is that smooth brome grass is a very weak stemmed grass, which is why it's used in a lot of like grass waterway situations. But that's not very useful for grassland nesting birds to either support or conceal their nests. And so although there is a lot of it on the landscape, grassland nesting birds choose to associate with other plant species. There are some stiff-stemmed plant species at the top of this list that birds avoided building nests near. Canada wildfire, rattlesnake, master, Canada goldenrod. These all have fairly stiff stems, but the growth form of the plant is such that the stems are sort of distributed, they're far apart, and so a bird can't use multiple stems to support the nest, which is what red-winged blackbirds and dickcissels in particular need when they're building a nest. On the bottom of this figure in green are the plant species that grassland nesting birds associated their nests with more often than you would expect given the commonness of the plant on the landscape. And a number of the species on this list, great-headed coneflower, wild bergamot, little and big bluestem, common milkweed, are stiff-stemmed plant species that have a growth form that are close enough together that they can support a bird nest. There are a couple of plants on this list that don't meet that general trend Canada thistle and reed canary grass at the bottom were both strongly associated with nest locations. These plants were sort of in the middle. They had weaker stems, but the plants themselves grow so densely that birds can still sort of get the clump of vegetation to hold up their nest, at least until the nest progresses through time and it gets heavy fledglings in it. And then these nests were prone to tipping over or flattening in a windstorm. So although there was an association of location here, that doesn't necessarily mean higher nest success, which we'll get to next. For our nest survival data, this was collected at the same time as our nest density data from 2015 to 2019. We found around 1,600 bird nests of 29 different species at those same 11 sites. About half of those were red-winged blackbird nests, about a quarter were dickcissels, and the other quarter was 27 other species. So on the next slide, the species on the left are the 9 grassland nesting passerines that we focused on, and the numbers of nests for each species. Again, those marked with an asterisk are species of greatest conservation need. The other species on the right are a mixture of shrub nesting birds, which we came across, or are grassland nesting non-passerines, which we didn't have enough of to make meaningful statements about. So our nest survival data, I just want to make a point that the results I'm sharing come from a global model with an all subsets model selection, where we build a big model with everything we think might be important to nest survival. And then through some statistical approaches, we shake out what the best predictors are. And we're not going to sort of go through all of them, but I'll focus again on the most important predictors of nest survival. So we're going to start out with habitat amount, and this is just the proportion of the land in some sort of grassland land cover within either 150 or 200 meters of a nest. And this was a really strong predictor of nest survival for dickcissels, with nests surviving longer on average the more grassland was nearby. And then we also had some configuration variables that were good predictors of nest success. Edge density makes an appearance here again. In a 33% grass landscape, you can see a nice strong relationship between edge density and nest success for dickcissels, a sort of a weaker effect for grassland nesting passerines as a group in black, and then either a negative or maybe a neutral effect for red-winged blackbirds. And those effects magnify in a 66% grass landscape, where the red-winged blackbird nest survival effect sort of flattens out and it's pretty clearly neutral or no effect. And then the slope increases for both dickcissels and grassland nesting passerines as a group. So higher nest survival in more complex landscapes that have more interactions between grassland habitat and either crop or other land covers. Because the nest data was point data, we were also able to include nest distance to crop edge, so measured at the nest level and not the patch level, to see whether or not crop edges in particular were affecting nest survival. On the left here, we have a landscape with very little grass in it, only 8% grass within a 150 or 200 meter radius circle. And we've got really wide confidence intervals. So I'm not going to lean on the effects in the really depauperate landscape there. But in a slightly more complicated landscape, 66% grass with some crop nearby, you can see that dickcissel nests that are right on the edge of grassland and row crop survived very poorly. And I think that this is due to nest parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds. Brown-headed cowbirds like to spend time foraging and loafing in the crop ground, and they happen to notice activity near dickcissel nests when the nests are right on the edge, when they're visible from the row crop field. And then the female cowbirds come back the next day and parasitize the dickcissel nests, which often leads them to fail. I think red-winged blackbirds don't have this same problem because blackbirds vigorously defend their nest. So even if the cowbirds are able to see the nest better, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to parasitize it. And then with blackbird nests surviving less well further from the crop edge, I don't have a specific mechanism for this other than it's probably predation related and maybe sort of a species specific predation related, but I don't have more data to explain that. Our vegetation variables that were important to nest survival included, again, both vegetation density and diversity. This slide is vegetation density. So more dense vegetation near the nest indicated a higher probability of fledging for red-winged blackbirds and grassland nesting passerines as a group, but not for dickcissels. And vegetation diversity was a good predictor. Next slide. Vegetation diversity was a good predictor of survival for blackbirds and grassland nesting passerines, again, but not for dickcissels. So we have a bunch of information about the specific ecological mechanisms on the landscape that may be affecting nest density or survival, but we also wanted to sort of wrap that up into a more digestible bottom line number for what this means for various kinds of conservation practice design. So we're going to look at that. On these slides, we have made estimates of the response variable. In this case, we're going to look at nest density first. We've got prairie vegetation communities in the right panel and lower diversity perennial grass vegetation communities on the left panel, and then a number of different sort of physical form factors that those could take, sort of landscape positions along the bottom. So for nest density, first we're going to look at prairie contour strips, and we're going to compare the nest density in prairie contour strips to nest density in large patch prairie restorations. And we can see that nest density was the same for dickcissels and blackbirds between those two conservation practices. But the prairie strips did have higher nest density for grassland nesting passerines as a community. Then comparing prairie contour strips to lower diversity grass contour strips, we did not see a difference in nest density. So the birds were not selecting these two vegetation communities at a different rate, which we're going to come back to in a minute. Looking at nest survival, the same sort of layout here. We have prairie contour strips on the right. When you compare nest survival in prairie contour strips to reference habitat, large patch prairie restorations, you see that there was no difference in nest survival between prairie strips and larger, presumably high quality prairie restoration habitat. Comparing prairie contour strips to lower diversity grass contour strips, nest survival was higher in the prairie strips for blackbirds and dickcissels, no statistical difference for grassland nesting passerines as a group. And then I just want to point out for the lower diversity, more linear practices such as a grass contour strip or a grass terrace, our absolute estimate of survival here was very low, like in the single digits sometimes. And that is concerning from a population sink standpoint, which we're going to discuss here in a minute. So we set up our study to compare prairie contour strips to large patch prairie restorations that we sort of our expert opinion felt was representative of the best habitat that was available in Iowa. And the idea is that if nest survival is equal between these two, then we don't have anything to worry about. is not a bad idea to also check some benchmark numbers that have been published. So estimating whether or not a habitat patch is a population sink is a very involved endeavor. And this is why most studies don't do it. They just look at nest survival as we did. But two reference studies in particular were useful as comparisons for us. And they've sort of established some benchmarks that say, okay, for this species, the nest survival should be about this high. Otherwise, the habitat is in danger of being a population sink. Nest survival is only part of the number. It also depends on fledgling and adult survival and fecundity. So these benchmarks are rough guides. So our high quality reference habitat, the large patch prairie restorations, did have somewhat lower nest survival than these published benchmarks, with some important caveats. So due to a difference in methodology, we're not able to compare the variance in their estimates, the variance in our estimates. Presumably, just looking at the variance in our estimates compared to their point estimates, I think probably there's going to be some overlap in the confidence intervals between them. And also, we were not able, or we chose not to do a fledgling and adult survival study. And it's possible that if those numbers were higher in our habitat, that may have offset lower nest survival. So I am presenting this for full disclosure that I think there is something to discuss here, that our reference habitat, the best habitat that we could find, looked like it may be on the lower end of what is acceptable compared to a limited number of previous benchmarks. So we selected that high quality habitat based on the size of the restoration and the quality of the vegetation, how, looking for a lack of invasive species issues. And I just want to emphasize that we really do believe that this is very high quality habitat that we were using for our reference. Doing a quick survey of patch sizes in Iowa, the minimum size of patch size needed to be in our study to be included in the large patch category was 8 hectares, but our two larger reference sites had about 30 hectare patches. On the left here, you can see 96% of the grass patches in Iowa are smaller than 30 hectares, and quite a number of them are smaller than 8 hectares. So being that it is among the top percentile patch sizes in Iowa, patches of any kind, not just prairie, and that the prairie vegetation is objectively well managed, diverse compared to what's available, I am willing to argue that these really were high quality reference sites. And if this doesn't meet the bar for a population sink, then this is going to be a larger regional issue and sort of goes beyond the scope of this study. So in summary, we found that habitat amount by itself was not a sufficient predictor of nest survival or density, with the exception that Dixisal nests did have higher survival when there was more grassland nearby. Landscapes had higher nest densities when there were more patches, higher non-crop edge densities, and more dense and diverse vegetation nearby. And we found that nest survival was higher when there were fewer patches, when they were larger, when there was higher edge densities, when nests were able to be placed further from a crop edge, and when there was more dense and diverse vegetation. And we found that habitat configuration effects are indeed important even after accounting for habitat amount. We found that fields with prairie strips have higher density of grassland birds, the birds themselves, than those with grass contour strips, although area sensitive birds were still largely absent from the agricultural conservation practices. We found that prairie strips had similar nest density and survival as large patch prairies, our reference habitat. However, prairie strips were better when there were fewer of them, when they were larger, and when they were located in more complicated landscapes with more diverse vegetation. Prairie strips had similar nest densities and higher nest survival than grass contour strips. And because the densities were similar to the higher quality habitat, and because the survival was so much lower in grass contour strips and grass terraces, that it is likely that these kinds of conservation practices are ecological traps, at least for the species that we studied. Some other general recommendations: large patch prairie restorations, such as those available with a full field CRP enrollment, are still needed for area sensitive birds. And probably the larger those restorations are, the better for core prairie habitat. However, land acquisition opportunities and budgets being limited, prairie strips do represent an improvement over the low diversity conservation practices that have dominated in past decades. And the accessibility of the CP43 program represents a major opportunity to improve wildlife habitat across large areas, while work also continues on more dedicated larger nature reserves. And I'll pass it back to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Matt. And just about to sum up here, but I also wanted to just come back to, while we were focusing on grassland birds in this presentation, highlight that we are doing other kinds of evaluation on the prairie strips on commercial farm fields as well, and just provide some key results from this ongoing research. Some of it is already published, much of it is in student thesis and dissertations, with the manuscripts now being prepared and submitted for journal article publication. But what we found so far is that strategically adding prairie strips to commercial farm fields is that under the prairie strips, we're seeing improvement in multiple soil health measures over time. However, while the soil health measures are improving under the prairie strips, we don't see those them having an impact on the adjacent cropland. So we can improve our crop fields, the soil health in our crop fields within that footprint of the prairie strip, but that doesn't apply to adjacent cropland soils. We're also seeing similar results in the water quality area that we found in the initial STRIPS 1 research. So reducing the total suspended solids and water runoff, the total amount of nitrogen in water runoff annually, as well as total phosphorus, both in the particulate phosphorus as well as dissolved phosphorus annually. So this is really cool that, the results that we found in our initial experiment, we're also seeing these results in the commercial farm environment. We're also seeing that prairie strips provide quality habitat for pollinators. We're seeing an increase in the abundance and diversity of native pollinators. Non-native pollinator, honeybee, but important economically, we're seeing that we increase honeybee health and productivity on fields with prairie strips as opposed to those that do not have prairie strips. And we're not seeing that prairie strips are exposing bees to higher levels of insecticides than they're already experiencing being in an agricultural environment. As Matt and I summarized, we were providing habitat for many grassland birds with prairie strips. However, prairie strips, we're not seeing some of those area sensitive birds. In another aspect of Matt's dissertation, he looked for snakes and lizards, and we're finding that prairie strips are not providing quality habitat for snakes and lizards in these landscapes. Work done by John Tyndall, a natural resource economist we work with, is showing that prairie strips are one of the most cost-effective conservation practices in this area, and especially when they're located on cropland that's chronically unprofitable. And finally, working with economists at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, Badri Khanal, Karina Schoengold, we found that through a willingness to pay survey that Iowans are willing to pay for the conservation benefits on crop fields associated with the conservation benefits such as we've measured in this project on crop fields associated with on crop fields with prairie strips. So in sum and final, I just want to offer a big thank you. This type of research that we're looking at multiple different metrics and working in a cropland, a private land, agricultural environment. It takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of institutions to make it work. And so here are the institutions that are either a part of the research or who have funded the research. It can't be done without such partnerships. And so I just want to give a big shout out to our partners and especially FSA for funding the bulk of this commercial, the research on prairie strips in the commercial farm environment. And with that, if there's questions, Rich, Jennifer, I'll get the final slide up here that you asked me to present, and hopefully we'll get some good conversation going through Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. And that, I mean, this has been a tremendous and tremendously beneficial body of work that that the STRIPS team has amassed over the past several years. You know, sincerely, well done. You know, while I have the mic, I guess maybe I'll take the opportunity to pose the first question or two to you both. First, you know, I guess relating more directly to the avian impacts of the practice, and you know, taking those to a you know, final ecosystem service or benefit meaningful to people. The aesthetic values associated with these strips, even anecdotally, you know, what have you found among the landowners and operators that have been participating in your field trials? Or, you know, and maybe relatedly, have you noticed, you know, practice adoption, you know, regardless, you know, CRP or otherwise, on the fields in the vicinity of your experimental plots?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rich. Well, we know from FSA data, right, that CRP signups are expanding, right? And not only in Iowa, but in adjacent states as well. So the latest data from, I think, October shows that there's over 15,000 acres of CP43 now in 14 states. We know of prairie strips in Kansas too, which isn't on that list. So we have 15,000 acres of prairie strips in 15 states now. That's amazing when you consider that in 2007, you know, of the prairie strips that we're aware of, you know, there weren't many, there were just a few acres, right? And starting in about 2012, because of the research results, farmers started coming forward and saying, you know, I think this makes sense for my field. I think I have a place on my farm where this will fit. And so between about 2012 and 2015, we saw many farmers coming forward. And by, you know, 2015, when we started this experiment, between the work that we were doing here in Iowa, partners at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, at the University of Northern Iowa, partners in Wisconsin, Santa County Foundation and such, we knew of about 60 farms with prairie strips. So we are seeing quite a lot of increase in adoption over time, which we're excited about. In terms of some of those aesthetic benefits that you mentioned, we don't have anything quantitatively data yet, but I can tell you through conversations I've had with farmers and farmland owners that you know, the prairie strips are providing all sorts of different benefits. You know, one of the farmers that I work with, he talks about how he keeps, you know, scissors in his glove box on his truck so that, you know, he can stop by his prairie strips on his way home and you know, cut a couple flowers and bring a bouquet home to his wife, right? So there's a, you know, real tangible benefit there. We, you know, we know of at least 3 farms that have prairie strips that a family member, either a daughter or a granddaughter, wanted to take their high school photographs on the farm next to the prairie strips. So again, you know, a way to engage the next generation on the farm. the next generation's interest in prairie strips and the beauty associated with them. I could go on and on with these stories. I love them, but we probably want time for other questions as well.
Sure, and yeah, thank you very much. That's I love that sort. Those are great anecdotes. Great, nice, heartwarming success stories. Let's see. Moving to the chat. First, Steve Strano asks. It was surprising that they didn't also take a look at switchgrass in terms of nesting. Any comments?
Yeah, somebody else had a question about sort of seed mixes and that nest association slide that I had. I guess I'll just stress that is derived from the square meter that the bird chose to nest in versus 3 other square meters located nearby. And this is only about the bird's choice of where to build the nest. I really think this is mostly down to the growth form of the plant and how useful that is to the grassland nesting birds. It turns out that they have some fairly strict requirements for exactly where they are able to build their nest. And so just because the birds didn't associate their nest with some species, that does not mean that it is not useful to those bird species or to any other wildlife. So switchgrass, for instance, should be a great seed source for birds. The other one was looking at Canada goldenrod and some others. Canada wild rye, again, should be a good seed food source for birds. So even though the birds didn't associate their nest with those species, doesn't mean that they're not valuable in the planting mix or that other species aren't getting some benefit from it.
Thank you. Destiny Flemings asks, what would make a particular section of land a good candidate for prairie strips? And maybe to my FSA colleagues on the call, can any producer do them if they were interested? Well, I guess any producer can, but I guess the question might also be what sort of financial and technical assistance may be available to them. So your initial thoughts, Lisa and Matt?
Yeah, so the conversations that I've had with farmers, almost everyone, they're coming because they know they have a resource constraint on their land. And usually that constraint, they're looking at, they know they have got an erosion problem, right? And that's what is driving their motivation to look at prairie strips as a conservation practice. And so they're thinking about how do I site this so I can reduce slow the flow of water across my farm field. One of the great things about CP 43 is that it can also fit on the end rows. Those tend to be lower profitability areas, tend to have high compaction, lower profitability for that reason. But then also farmers end up having to farm up and down hill slopes there. So being able to put that land in prairie strips and improve their overall field level profitability and reduce erosion. That's another thing that we've heard from farmers with prairie strips being an attractive practice. So it's usually that resource constraint, usually soil, that is the first motivator. But beyond that, different farmers express different reasons for prairie strips, and then the design. You're trying to address both the resource constraint as well as the other objectives that the farmers might have, or farmland owner. For example, some of them are very interested in grassland birds. Some of them are interested in pollinators, pollinator habitat. We hear some of them talk about wanting to just have more wildness on the farm. So it's highly variable. Of course, here in Iowa, many farmers also talk about wanting to provide a solution that not only addresses their water quality concerns, but also, not only their soil erosion concerns, but also water quality. So the fact that prairie strips, it's these multiple benefits, these multiple things that farmers can address simultaneously, I think is one of the reasons it's very attractive, as well as the flexibility of the practice.
Well, now that you mentioned that, speaking of pollinator habitat, what do you think, and I know you've written a bit about this, what do you think the implications are of this practice to soybean yields in the Corn Belt?
Yeah, that's a great question. And last year, along with a global team of authors, I published a paper looking at the adjacency of natural habitat to soybean fields and whether there could be impact on soybeans. What we saw in the global data is that there is a trend with the proximity and amount of natural habitat to increase yields. However, the amount of data from the region that I work in, specifically the Corn Belt, is pretty scant. And I think so the data that we look at globally is really only suggestive. At this point, I'm not telling farmers to go plant prairie strips and they'll improve their soybean yield. We need a lot more evaluation before we could make that recommendation. There's probably interacting factors there. Not only is it the amount of habitat for pollinators, but that also depends on the yield, or sorry, the variety of soybeans. And there also might be a temperature effect.
Thanks. Laura Jackson, I think you may know her, asks where we can get a hold of the grassland patch size distribution data.
Sure. That is based on the USDA Cropscape land cover data set, remotely sensed with 30-meter pixel size. And I just did that calculation myself. If Laura or anybody else is interested in a summary of that, I'd be happy to send it to them.
Brendan Walker asks, what is the effect of predation from mammals using these strips? I guess a population sync question.
Yeah, so this is one of the motivating ideas behind my research in landscape ecology. There's a classical thought that narrower, more linear patches of habitat may be easier for predators to search more efficiently or completely. The bottom line is that the prairie strips stack up favorably against our larger nonlinear reference habitat. So the sum total is that no, we don't see an effect from that. However, our nest survival data isn't broken down by species, so it's sort of an average effect across all potential nest predators. We also ran a study looking to see how mammals were moving through the landscape, both in the high diversity strips, low diversity strips, and larger block habitat. And that analysis is forthcoming. Hopefully we'll have some insights as to how particular predator species are using the landscape.
Here's an interesting one. I believe this is being recorded, so for your awareness, what has been the response of your commercial ag sponsors to this work, to your findings?
Yeah, uniformly positive. So one of the things that I think has just been really cool about this project is that, if you have data, right, to show kind of the impact, it opens up conversations that it's harder to have if you're just talking up from hypotheticals, right? And so what I've found is, working with farmers as well as working with ag businesses, as well as the commodity groups, they're all interested in the data that we've collected, and we can have a really robust conversation about, efficiently achieving conservation outcomes in agricultural landscapes based on data.
Great to hear. Let's see. So Destiny also notes that we use, there are a variety of plants that we have in our seed mixes that may not be best for nesting, given their nest preference diagram, like Canada wildride, goldenrod, switchgrass. Do they nevertheless have do you see that them as having any value wildlife from a wildlife perspective? Yeah.
Sure. I would say the goal is to have the highest diversity native seed mix that you can get. Certainly that's going to include some easier to establish species such as goldenrod or switchgrass. And even if the birds don't associate their nests with them, they may be useful to birds for other parts of their life cycle. And certainly they may be important for other species, to pollinators or to mammals, or just about anything. These systems are so complicated, it's hard to guess which specific plant species may be important to which specific part of the ecosystem. So I would say if you can afford it, plant it.
I guess the thing I would add to that, Matt's answer is great, but I, really want to point out the differences that we're finding between, the native species cover and then the smooth brome, which is the typical conservation cover that's been used in these landscapes for over time. Well, we don't have data on tall fescue, which is used more frequently as you move further south. I would say, just based on the stature of the life history of the plant, that probably similarly you would see those results, similar results with tall fescue if you move further south. So using diverse native seed mixes, if the goal really is for a conservation benefit, that's what we're seeing is what the data suggests is going to be the most beneficial. Of course, there might be some locations where smooth brome makes perfect sense, like in a grass waterway situation. But in other areas of the farm, say, just a filter strip situation, or, on those end rows, if you can afford it, go for that native vegetation mix.
Thank you. Last but not least, do you have the vegetation establishment data, persistence of forage species data in a readily available format?
So the data that we presented, or data just generally from the STRIPS project,
Good question. I guess I'm assuming the any of those data that you may have amassed in the STRIPS project.
Okay, yeah, certainly. From STRIPS 1, we do have a paper published in 2013 by Sarah Hirsch. Another master's student finished in 2019, Lydia English, I believe, and I think her publication should soon come out. And then you mentioned Laura Jackson from the Tallgrass Prairie Center has been doing evaluations as well of vegetation establishment and impact of management. And Laura, if you're still on, and if you want to pipe up about where that information is available, please do.
Yeah, I'm still here, headed to Ames tonight for the PFI cooperators meeting.
Awesome.
Yeah, we have field experiments that are, a couple of them are published in Restoration Ecology. Those are not on farms, but those are testing different types of seed mix designs and their implications for ecosystem services. And then we have a large scale study, and those are linked on our website, Tallgrass Prairie Center. And then we have a large scale 2-year study of pollinator habitat that we're trying to get that whipped up into manuscript form. So that's not available yet. On-farm studies are a little harder to do. The farmers don't necessarily keep track of all the information.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the end of the questions to you. I will pass it back to my colleague Jennifer. And again, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This has been a wonderful presentation. I did want to note that the Conservation Director with USDA Farm Services Agency, TJ, did make a note in the comment thanking you for your work, and that your findings will help us strike the right balance on CRP policy to make sure we're continuing to adapt and address related concerns. So again, thank you for your wonderful work today. As a reminder, the slides and recording will be available on the Natural Resources and Analysis website. Please allow us a few days to get this transcribed and the recording up. We expect it to be posted next week. So thanks again for your time, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.